Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar to discuss our bull management during winter. I look forward to having some great conversations with you all throughout and at the end of the presentation today. Ultimately, our goal today is we might be wrapping up with breeding season and moving into our winter management. And this is a great time to not forget about our bulls and throw them out on the back burner. This is a great time to think about our nutrition and setting these guys up for success moving into that next breeding season. And so today, briefly, we just want to talk about that importance of our bulls during the breeding season. What's going on? What are some things we need to think about and monitor while we're moving through the breeding season? And then after that breeding season, and thinking about some winter nutrition considerations. And then what are some of those impacts that cold weather can have on fertility? And then what are some things we should consider moving into that next breeding season? And so I've got a few producer questions here tonight that look forward to getting some feedback from everyone. And so our first producer question is, what are your breeding methods for your cows? You only expose your cows to bulls. Maybe you only utilize artificial insemination. Maybe you do a combination of AI and bull exposure. Maybe you breed your females, or maybe you're just on today. You don't have any cows, but you're wanting to learn more, or maybe the options here just don't work for you and what your operation is. Just give everybody a few minutes. Ultimately, when we're thinking about our bulls and what our bull battery really means in terms of our breeding season, these guys provide over half of the genetics in that calf crop. And so being able to manage our bulls effectively moving into that breeding season is going to be important. And understanding that importance of our bulls. So from the poll, it looks like a majority either expose their cows to bulls or maybe do a combination of AI and then natural service cover after AI. So when USDA sent a survey out, this was the newest or most recent, they just did another study here in 2017, but back in 2009, NOMS asked producers what their primary breeding methods were. And you can see that they asked a couple different questions related to heifer and cow breeding methods. And then you could see that a large majority, almost over 90% of cows were bred and only exposed to bulls and bred natural service. And so if you think about that compared to our AI or our combination, which is the next highest, you can see that the bulls are highly utilized in most of our breeding programs. And so how we manage these guys moving into breeding during the breeding season and then after is going to be pretty critical to ensure that our semen quality is there. These bulls are physically fit and able to get the job done during that breeding season. And so I've got another question here. And so when we're thinking about moving and transitioning our bulls, you know, we've gone through this breeding season. We know these guys are critical for increasing our genetics within the herd and ultimately getting that breeding season done. And so getting those cows pregnant. And so where do our bulls go over winter? Provided a few options here for our producer question. Do you separate your bulls and send them into their own bull pasture? Maybe you throw them in a dry lot situation. Do they stay out with your cows? Maybe you do some preg checks and pull those guys out for a little bit, but then they go back out with the cows. Maybe they go out on corn residue, depending on where you're at in the state, and if you have those resources available, or maybe you do a combination. But I'll just give everyone a couple minutes to answer the question, or at least think about where their bulls go and how you manage your bulls moving into the winter and after that breeding season. So looking at the poll here, looks like a majority either go to a bull pasture or stay out with the cows. A couple answers for that corn residue, and so I think we've got a combination there of turning those bulls out with cows on corn residue. So a lot of different options when we think about where these guys can go and how we're going to manage them. And so what I want us to think about is where these bulls are at during the breeding season, the differences in playing and nutrition or that workload and what we're asking of them, and how we can manage them either through that breeding season or after. And so when we're looking at that breeding season, there's some work from Dahlin and Stoltenau in 2015 up in North Dakota, looking at bull workload. And so they saw a wide variation in bull workload that ranged anywhere from 4 to 80 females per bull. And so if we have bulls that are more dominant, they're gonna be working a lot. If you notice that some of your bulls might be a little thinner, those are majority of those bulls are going to be the ones that are working, and those dominant bulls that have high libido that are going to be trying to cover as many females as possible. And so although we may have a specific bull to cow ratio within our breeding pastures, which generally is going to be recommended about that 1 to 20, but that can vary depending on pasture size, workload for those bulls, age of those bulls. If we're incorporating a synchronization program or something where that workload is going to be heavier in the front of that breeding season, and so ensuring that we've got enough bulls in there to cover females, size of that pasture, libido, the semen quality that we see with covering those bulls breeding soundness exams prior to that season. That gives us a lot of information on how we can manage those bulls in those pastures. But obviously there is a wide range of workload. And so we're going to see a greater potential loss or maintaining that weight due to that workload. And so there's been some reports, and we know that bulls can lose weight during that breeding season. And this can be upwards of anywhere from 100 to 400 pounds. It really depends on, if these are our younger yearling bulls, or maybe our more mature bulls that are getting a lot of work in during that breeding season. And so one thing that we need to think about and consider is our young bulls are still growing during that breeding season. And so if we can monitor those bulls and monitor that weight loss, that's going to be really important when we think about reconditioning these bulls after the breeding season and moving into that next breeding season. And so this is a great time when bulls are done with the breeding season. We can evaluate their condition, and then we can feed and manage them so we can get them back to that moderate condition, usually around that body condition score 6 at that beginning of the next breeding season. And so it's common for these bulls to lose upwards of 10 to 15% of their body weight during the breeding season. And so that's where we see that 100 to 400 pounds. And that's going to vary depending on that age and weight of that bull. And so this is a great time to evaluate those bulls annually, especially for health and their ability to cover those females, and gives us an opportunity to get some weight gain before that next breeding season. And so it's generally recommended that we regain body weight in preparation for that subsequent breeding season to ensure that, again, those bulls are going to be working, they're athletes, and we want to make sure that we're setting them up for success moving into that next breeding season. And so typically, when we're done with that breeding season, we have an opportunity to manage those bulls a little differently once we evaluate those that condition or maybe body loss, taking a look at those feet and legs. And so we usually can separate these guys out into pastures, or maybe we have one larger bull pasture, but this is an opportunity to really target those different groups of bulls. And so we have our older, more dominant bulls that are probably going to still be in decent condition. And then we're going to have our younger or maybe thin bulls. And so this is a great opportunity to separate these bulls into two different groups. And then we can manage and feed them so that we can make sure that these younger bulls are still growing, and we can target and get them to roughly be at 65 to 75% of their mature size at the beginning of that next breeding season. And so if we can separate those bulls early after that breeding season, we can get 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds a day gain for those younger bulls. Most of our mature bulls are going to be in good condition. We can manage those and maintain them on 100% forage diet. Generally, if we can get roughly about 7% crude protein and 50% TDN, we can maintain those bulls, but highly recommend managing and visually looking at their condition to make sure that they're maintaining that body weight and we're not losing condition during the winter. Another really important thing to consider is having a good mineral program. And if we can provide mineral and vitamins, these are great for growth and performance. We've seen impacts on reproductive performance with mineral programs and supplementation. And so our younger bulls, and even just maintaining function of sperm motility and normal spermatogenesis, there's data that's found that selenium is critical for normal spermatogenesis. And also zinc plays a pretty big role in male fertility. So when we think about motility of that tail and morphology, zinc plays a critical role in that sperm cell plasma membrane integrity. And so this is what helps that sperm move through that tract and gives that tail that morphology and ultimately that motility to move through the tract and get to that egg. Another mineral that's important is iodine. This has been shown to help alleviate foot rot. And so if we had bulls that maybe were in some wetter pastures or having some issues with foot rot, being able to get them set up on a good mineral program can help with overall performance, growth, and some of these other ailments that we might have seen coming out of that breeding season. So briefly, just wanted to talk about some examples of nutrient requirements for our bulls and those varying levels of gain. And so our table here has body weight in pounds down this column, and then ultimately provides a couple different scenarios of average daily gain that we're trying to meet for those bulls, what that intake would look like, and then basically meeting those requirements in terms of energy and protein. And so the first group that I like to highlight would be our high risk bulls who are maybe young and thin. And those guys need a diet that consists of a roughage at about 2% of their body weight. And so if we're thinking about, hey, a 1,400 pound bull, and at 2% of his body weight, that's going to be about roughly or 2 pounds a gain, roughly about 28 pounds of dry matter intake a day. And then making sure that we're targeting a higher crude protein level there. This is also an opportunity for those younger bulls if we can include a grain to bump that protein up, into that 8 to 9% crude protein. And depending on that quality of that forage, if we're in that 55 to 65% TDN, we can usually supplement with some grain. And so that's usually going to be about 3 to 6 pounds of a grain product, maybe a corn or a distiller's grain to help meet those requirements. So if you need help working through some of your bull diets, definitely reach out to your extension beef educator or personnel or specialist, and we can work through targeting some of those gains for your younger or maybe thin bulls. Now, want to switch gears a little bit, and we have that other group of bulls that we're trying to manage, and so those are going to be our mature bulls that are going to be in pretty moderate condition. So we're in that 5 to 6 body condition score, and so we want to be able to maintain these bulls through winter. And so these guys can primarily be managed on a forage diet, depending on chill factors and those types of things. We may need to consider adding a little bit of energy for those guys just to maintain condition, but those will be in some of those extreme conditions. But if we have a hay that roughly consists of 7% crude protein and about 50% TDN, we can have a daily intake of about 1.5 to 2% of body weight for those guys, which ultimately accounts for anywhere from 30 to 40 pounds of dry matter, depending on the quality of that feed, to make sure that we're targeting about 7% crude protein for those guys. And so those differences between those younger bulls that might have lost weight during the breeding season, they're still growing. We need to get upwards of 2 pounds a day gain on those to regain that weight they lost, and then add additional weight to still make sure that we're targeting about 75% of their mature body weight by 2 years of age in that next breeding season. If we can manage these bulls a little differently, that can help. And so when we're thinking about reconditioning our yearling bulls after that breeding season, like I mentioned, these guys, this is an example where we're turning out in April. And so our yearling bulls are probably about 1,200 pounds, body condition 5. This was an example I threw in here for roughly 90 days breeding season. So these guys are going to be working. They're yearling bulls. They're going to be losing some weight. And so we might come to the end of breeding season, early July, and these bulls lost about 300 pounds. They're 900 pounds and worked and are about a body condition score 3. So this is a great opportunity, although that our forage may be in declining in quality towards the end of our grazing season. This is a great opportunity towards that end of that grazing season and time at weaning to be able to maybe pull these bulls in or think about some supplementation strategies to start slowly gaining that weight back. Since we've got time to get these bulls back in condition and then gain that weight back over that winter time period to make sure that they're reaching that target percent mature body weight moving into that that next breeding season. And so these bulls will be winter grazed. And so depending, like we saw in our producer question, these bulls might be out in their own bull pasture. Maybe this is an opportunity to throw those bulls out on some corn residue with cows and supplement them with a grain distiller's product where we can work on targeting and getting some extra gain on these guys. And so we roughly have about 120 days through winter until that next breeding season where we can put weight on those bulls. And so this will be really critical, especially for our yearling bulls, to make sure that we get them around that body condition score 6 and targeting that 65 to 75% mature body weight. So we know that these bulls are going to go through and lose some weight in the next breeding season, but these guys are still growing. And so we want to make sure that we're meeting their requirements. And so thinking about moving through that winter phase, we know that cold weather can impact fertility, and especially when we think about wind chill and that cold weather damaging tissues. And so the number one cause is going to be those blisters or scabs that are going to occur from frostbite. And so frostbite will appear as kind of a discoloration or scab or a sloughing of that lower scrotal portion. And so if we have tissue damage, we need to keep in mind that the spermatogenesis cycle takes upwards of 61 days. And so if we have an insult during that winter, that sperm that's within that cycle is going to be impacted, and the quality or basically impacting that fertility or infertility of those bulls. And so if we have an injury, reevaluating those bulls with the breeding soundness exam will be critical to make sure that semen quality is there, and we're not impacting anything else prior to that next breeding season. There is some work looking at the effect of severity of frostbite on semen quality in bulls, where they took satisfactory, questionable, or unsatisfactory breeding soundness scores and looked at that severity of frostbite. And so the percentage of bulls that had unsatisfactory breeding soundness exam scores increased to 26.7% of those bulls when frostbite was moderate. And you can see that with a severe frostbite injury, we have a large majority of those bulls that had frostbite were unsatisfactory in terms of their semen quality at that time of that breeding soundness exam. So if we think about insults, most of the time when we're taking a breeding soundness exam, this is a snapshot in time. And so what happened 60 days ago is usually going to be representative of that snapshot in time that we're seeing in terms of that semen quality and maybe that potential for unsatisfactory soundness exam. And so, as I mentioned on that previous slide, if we can manage and give our bulls enough time to recover and retest these guys roughly 4 to 6 weeks after that first initial breeding soundness exam, we usually can get past that insult and then allow that semen quality to improve, hopefully, and test those guys and see if we still have any insults to that semen quality or if they'll be ready to go for that next breeding season. This is some work from Wiltbank and Parrish in the 80s, looking at how sperm quality will affect pregnancy rates in a herd. And so this these numbers here are the number of females that were pregnant with how many that they had within each respective group. And so our blue columns here are going to be a random group of bulls. So they got their semen test or breeding soundness exam done. They selected a random group of bulls, or they selected bulls that had greater than 80% normal sperm. So if we think about our breeding soundness exam, if we're at least 60 to 70% normal sperm, those are satisfactory numbers. But they're selecting a higher percentage of bulls or higher semen quality in these bulls and doing some comparisons here. And they noted that in year 1, they had a 6% increase in pregnancy rates by selecting for higher quality semen or sperm, normal sperm, compared to just a random group of bulls that they had tested that had passed a BSE. They saw similar results moving into year 2 with a 5% increase in pregnancy rates with those bulls that had greater than 80% normal sperm. So being able to ensure that we're getting a breeding soundness exam performed on those bulls, if that's prior to that breeding season, or maybe when we're purchasing new bulls, or even monitoring our bulls that we already have on our operation, we can see that impact is 5 to 6% greater if we've got those bulls that have greater quality sperm. So a couple more producer questions here to wrap up the question portion of today's talk. But the first question I'd like to ask is, do you have a breeding soundness exam performed on bulls that you purchase? So majority, 100% of those of you that are on perform a breeding soundness exam on bulls. So this could either be done when you've purchased the bull, or maybe after you've purchased bulls and taking those back to your operation. Now, to switch that question up, do you have a breeding soundness exam performed on bulls that are already on your operation? So these bulls have not recently been purchased, but these are bulls that you use in subsequent breeding seasons that have already been on the ranch. And looks like a majority of you that are on also perform breeding soundness exams on on those bulls that are already on the operation. There are some interesting results which are a little different than the results of those of you that are on. But 57% from the NOM survey, USDA survey, indicated that 57% of operations that purchased bull had a BSE conducted on those newly bulls introduced. And so we're much higher here on the webinar tonight compared to those that were surveyed here in this survey. But this was a much lower result. Only 17% of cow-calf operations had a BSE done on bulls that were already on their operation. So this is a great opportunity if we conduct a BSE to check these bulls. And this is a great opportunity to identify any subfertile bulls that may not be done generally. So if we can check for subfertile bulls, maybe we had some lower pregnancy rates, we can identify some of those issues even after a breeding season by checking some of those bulls and getting a breeding soundness exam done. So want to briefly just highlight what are some of those components of a breeding soundness exam. We've been talking about it throughout today's talk. And so this is a uniform method of assessing the bull's likelihood of establishing pregnancy in an appropriate number of females who are healthy and cycling either cows or heifers within a defined breeding season. And so when we take these bulls in, they're generally examined, or there's usually 4 components of this exam. So we have a physical exam, which they're going to check feet and legs. Eyes are really important for these guys to be able to see who's mounting, where they need to go. They need to be able to travel distances to ensure that they can cover females. And so they're going to do that physical exam, and then they're going to get in and palpate and look at reproductive organs and palpate to make sure there aren't any inflammation or issues with those reproductive organs. We're going to do a scrotal circumference. And so this is looking at scrotal circumference and making sure that they're at a minimum circumference for the age of that bull. And then we evaluate sperm motility and morphology. So if our bulls are unsatisfactory or questionable, generally recommend 4 to 6 weeks and retesting those bulls and ultimately making sure that we give them enough time. So if we think about spermatogenesis cycle at 61 days, we want to make sure that if these bulls aren't passing, we give them a few weeks and can retest again to make sure that if there was any insults back during the winter or injury, that cycle has passed, and we can ensure that that semen quality is going to be good moving into that breeding season. So, what are some things or considerations for getting ready for that next breeding season? Like I mentioned, if we can consider performing a breeding soundness exam on those bulls roughly 30 to 60 days before the start of that next season, this will make sure that if we do need to find a different bull, or if we have some issues, we have enough time before that breeding season. This is also a great time to get our annual evaluations done on those bulls. So an opportunity to vaccinate those bulls with our cows. So having a conversation with your local vet to make sure that we're vaccinated for any reproductive diseases, and then controlling insects such as lice and flies, and then checking those feet and legs. These bulls need to be able to cover ground and cover females. And so this is a great time to evaluate these bulls. And then ultimately, before that next breeding season, if we can allow those bulls to establish their dominance prior to the breeding season, they'll be less likely to worry about who's the head bull in that pen, and get out to that breeding pasture and breed some females. And so if we can make sure that if we're introducing those bulls in their breeding groups early, those guys have figured it out. They have plenty of space to be able to figure that out. So there's going to be some pushing and making sure that that space is clear, so we don't have any injuries prior to that breeding season. So today's topic, we're thinking about how we're managing those bulls after the breeding season and into that next. Cold weather prevention is going to be key. And so if we can protect these bulls from severe winter weather, particularly that wind chill, this is going to be a great opportunity to help reduce any body energy loss, and make sure we're not damaging any other tissues. So particularly that extreme cold can freeze that lower part of that scrotum. We talked about those impacts of frostbite on fertility. And so ultimately, if we damage or reduce that semen quality by damaging that lower part of the scrotum, we start seeing issues or those repercussions later on prior to the breeding season. So if we can provide plenty of space for those bulls to ensure that we get that pecking order figured out, and room to move and to be active, are great. Providing some type of shelter or windbreak will help reduce that and help with protection of that wind or severe weather bouts. And then also providing bedding to help protect from that frozen ground. We want them to be able to maintain their body heat. If they're on frozen ground and they're having to maintain body heat, and then also make sure that they're not freezing that lower part of that scrotum. If we can provide some type of bedding in there to help offset that, we can make sure that we're managing that condition and maintaining that body heat through the colder winter weather. So ultimately, what's the bottom line? We know that our nutritional management is going to be critical for the success of these bulls moving through a breeding season, and then ultimately after and preparing them for the next. And so we know that bulls contribute over half of those genetics to our cow herd, and his fertility is critical. And so this is a great opportunity moving into winter. If we're culling any bulls for any injury issues, or maybe not passing that BSE, this is a great opportunity to be able to separate our older or maybe younger, thinner bulls in a couple different pastures and manage them accordingly to ensure that we can get body weight gain back on those young, thin bulls, and maintain that body weight in our older bulls. So they're moving into that breeding season roughly at that body condition score 6. Again, moving into the winter, if we can give bulls plenty of space to move and offer protection from that severe weather to avoid frostbite will be really important for that overall semen quality if we can avoid those frostbite issues. Uh, our bulls, our mature bulls that are in good condition can generally be sustained on that 7% protein, 50% TDN forage diet. And so knowing how we can manage our younger bulls in those different pens and then ensuring that those younger bulls that need to gain a couple pounds a day, we increase that protein and energy level to make sure that we can get that appropriate gain. And then ultimately consider performing a body or breeding soundness exam on each bull roughly 30 to 60 days before the start of the next breeding season to make sure if we did have any insults during that winter time period that we can get a game plan moving forward into that breeding season or allow them some time to be rechecked for that breeding soundness exam. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody. If you do have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is there on the slide. And I look forward to a discussion about the current topic and any other comments regarding bull nutrition and management during the winter months. So thank you.